of International Special Lecture Series organized by School of Shastric Learning, Kavikulaguru Kalidas Sanskrit University, Ramte. First of all, I would like to welcome Chairperson of today's program, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Madhusudan Penna, sir, who is not just the source of inspiration for organizing this event, but also constant support. And it is he who actually made it happen. And welcome, sir. And it is an honor to welcome today's guest speaker, Francis Brassard, sir, lecturer at RIT Croatia. It is an honor to welcome you, sir. Today's guest speaker from Rochester Institute of Technology, New York, USA. On behalf of Kavikulaguru Kalidas Sanskrit University, I welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my name is Francis Brassard.
Yes.
I'm Canadian, so French Canadian, and I live now in Dubrovnik. Some of you may know a little bit about this city if you've seen the film Fan with Shahrukh Khan. So it was mostly
yes, sir.
made in my city where I live. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I just we have just a few introductory remarks, and then we'll start with you, sir.
Okay.
Okay. So I would like to welcome Campus Director Professor Kavita Hole, Madam, and I would also like to welcome Professor Parag Joshi, sir, Director, School of Shastric Learning, and I also would like to welcome all the deans of the faculties, heads of the various departments, directors, and other participants from School of Shastric Learning also. And now I would like to request Professor Parag Joshi, sir, Director, School of Shastric Learning, to give introductory remarks.
Thanks, Shweta ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes. Okay. Udghatya yoga kalaya hridayabjakosham dhanyaischiradapi yatha ruchi gryhyamanaha yaha prasphuratyaviratam paripurna rupaha shreyasame dishatu shashwatikam mukundaha. Namassabhayai. First of all, I welcome Mr. Francis sir, who is present here for delivering his lecture. So thank you, sir, for being here. I will briefly introduce about this school and this event in a couple of minutes only. School of Shastric Learning, Shastra Vidya Gurukulam of KKSU has been engaged in various academic activities apart from the teaching learning, like Shastra Deepika, lecture series on various Shastra text. Every Friday on a weekly basis, we conduct this Shastra Deepika lecture series, and also Shastra Prabha, the Vakyartha Sabha on various Shastra Granthas, which is conducted by our school, the School of Shastric Learning, weekly or monthly once in a traditional way. Also, we conduct some Arhana program to celebrate our Indian culture and our different rituals, and many more programs and events are conducted by this school. Recently, we have conducted one Bhashotsava program, which was a national seminar where many scholars of India who came here, and they have been just engaged in their own thoughts based on the schools of philosophies and Bhashya Granthas, Bhashya Parampara of Indian School of Philosophies. So in this connection, to mark the occasion of 25th year of celebration, Rajatotsava of Kavikulaguru Kalidas Sanskrit University, we have this organized international lecture series to mark the occasion of Rajatotsava. Shastra Seva Pravartatam. With this motto, we are conducting all other events. And in this same connection, this school is actively organizing different various academic activities under the able and noble guidance of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Madhusudan Penna, sir. Now we have just one thing with us, that let the noble thoughts come from all over world. Ano bhadra kratavo yantu vishwataha. To welcome the noble thoughts from all over world, we have just organized this international lecture series to welcome the different various thoughts of international speakers and scholars like you, sir. So first of all, I welcome you on behalf of School of Shastric Learning and on behalf of KKSU. You are mostly welcome, sir. And it's over to you, Shweta ma'am. You just briefly
Thank you, sir.
introduce our today's guest speaker, and then we will have his lecture.
Sure,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Sure, sir. Thank you. Thank you. It is indeed my privilege to introduce Francis Brassard, sir. He is our first speaker. And Francis Brassard, sir, is from Quebec, Canada. And he's received his PhD from McGill University in Religious Studies. He also studied at Institute for Culture and Justice Indians and Tibet's Hamburg University, Germany, and at Somaiya Bharatiya Sanskrit University, Mumbai. And his research interest includes Buddhist philosophy and psychology, comparative religion, religious and philosophies. And his first book, The Concept of Bodhicitta, in Shanti Deva's Bodhi Karyavatar, was published in Sunny Press in 2000. And he recently published Meeting the Others in Their Differences towards a Christian approach in the scientific study of religions, Kalamazoo, in 2021. So without further ado, I would like to request Francis sir to address the audience.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sharma. So first of all, I would like to thank the Kavikulaguru Kalidas Sanskrit University for this opportunity to present a lecture on this 25th anniversary. This is an interesting coincidence, as my university, IRT Croatia, is also celebrating its 25th anniversary. So, I would also like to thank Professor Kala Acharya, a friend and a mentor for more than 30 years. I was very happy that she introduced me to you. I hope that will be the beginning of a very fruitful collaboration. So at the outset of this presentation, I have to say that I'm not very much familiar with the traditional Indian system of education. However, I did, however, experience how sacred scriptures were taught to young people in the Pathashala system when I visited in India. I think it was in almost 25 years ago. I was very much impressed by their ability to memorize large chunk of text. From that experience, I have been convinced that oral tradition may be, depending on the circumstances, more reliable than written tradition. I often refer to the traditional Indian way of teaching and learning to make my students aware of the cultural differences and some of the presupposition we may entertain in the West, where religions of the book prevail and reliance on documents, written documents, for example, is so important. I was also fortunate to have, as one of my teachers, Professor Hori from McGill University. Professor Hori is a Buddhist Zen practitioner and a scholar who look at the differences between traditional and modern pedagogical approaches. He made a clear distinction between a task-oriented approach and a person-oriented approach. The first one is what is dominating in the West, and it has been developed to train people to become efficient technicians. The second one focuses on the development of the person, and it is to be found in all cultures and religious traditions. I believe that the traditional approaches or the traditional teaching approaches are of the second type, that is more person-oriented. So this is something I would like to explore more in the future, and I hope maybe one day having more collaboration with your university, that will be something of interest for me. So I want to look in particular its connection what I mean here is the traditional way of teaching. So its connection to the development of creativity and the ability to solve problems. So in other words, do the traditional teaching approaches better prepare us to the scientific challenge of the future? So this is an open question for me. Or although the first approach, the task-oriented approach, seems to be easier to implement and appears to give better results, it is nonetheless limited to its own sphere of expertise. We could even say that it may be useless or even an obstacle in bringing us to the next shore of scientific discovery. So, leaving aside for the moment the nature and aims of pedagogical approach, I would like to focus today's presentation on a problem that is developing in education, especially Western institutions. So I don't know to what extent it applies to India, but at least I'm going to focus more on Western institutions. And even it concerns not only universities, but also the lower levels of instruction, even going as far as primary and secondary school. So some of you are probably familiar with the concept of critical race theory that is now creeping into the US system of education, in which race plays a dominant role in the context of school curriculum. One extreme example of an application of CRT, or critical race theory, is to say that mathematics, as they are taught in the West, are expression of racism. Now, it is true that culture does affect the content of science and what is deemed important to be taught to the next generations. But the fact that an entire discipline is labeled as racist, that takes it to another dimension. First, it is very reductionist and introduces a secularity in which a view is projected onto an object, and that object reflects back the very view that was projected onto it. This is the reason why critical race theory has been defined as a form of neo-Marxism. Everything is viewed from the prism of one single principle. As we know, in the case of Marxism, it is the struggle in the principle in class struggle. Secondly, and this is the most pernicious effect of critical race theory, by imposing a label racism, it associates the whole discipline to something socially toxic. It is, so to speak, a curse that is likely to chase away the next generation of students, not to mention the loss of credibility it may undergo in the general population. In other words, the purpose of such a label is to induce a sense of shame, and by the same token to erase that which has thus been labeled from the cultural landscape of a community or a nation. So the topic of my presentation may appear a little bit pessimistic. I know it is 25th anniversary, it is an occasion for celebration. However, I believe it's an important one, as I strongly think that ancient tradition may contribute to the development of the human spirits. I'm also quite sensitive to the attempts, and maybe this is more in the West, but I'm not sure, the attempts to discredit those ancient traditions. I'm also particularly interested in the psychological and social mechanism at work in such attempts. I am of the opinion that a greater awareness of those mechanisms may allow us to have a greater confidence in the knowledge and values that we inherited from our ancestors. So the basic lecture is in part based on another lecture I delivered almost prophetically at a symposium on memory and reconciliation. I said prophetically because although it was meant for the Croatian context, I believe that the ideas discussed have revealed themselves to be more and more actual as well as universal. So to some extent, I wrote that almost 5 years ago, and you know, when you write a paper, usually you are a little bit projecting in the future, hoping that it will not happen. But then looking at what happened in the past years, I was very surprised to see how far this mechanism I'm going to talk about is developing or is affecting us. So the title of my previous lecture was Shame as a Means of Social Control. I wanted to show that the sense of shame towards one's culture and history is used to create a kind of division at the level of an individual himself, thus making him vulnerable to being manipulated. So let's start with what could be viewed as an anecdote taken from the history of India. So this is, I think you will be able to relate to it. It will be used to show that the power of shame in inhibiting creativity and self-realization, as well as to how little it takes to be quite effective if we don't pay attention to how it happens. So when Gandhi returned in India in 1915, he was no longer the man who left his native land 20 years earlier to work as a legal representative for the Indian merchants of South Africa. Indeed, Gandhi arrived in the British colony as a simple lawyer trained in matters of law and jurisprudence of the British Empire, as someone who, to a certain extent, had gladly adopted its customs and idiosyncrasies. According to one of its commentators, when Gandhi lived in England, he spent lavishly on clothes and he was aping the English aristocratic way of life. Even in South Africa, while other Indians were dressed in pajamas and wore the turban or the fez, Gandhi, here I quote, was also very conscious of his appearance and selected the finest clothes. Regarding of the weather, he immaculately dressed in a suit and tie and spent time grooming his hair. This obsession with Western fashion was again projected when, on his second trip to South Africa, he brought along his wife and children and insisted that they dress up with gloves and stockings and socks and shoes, as was the case with the Western aristocracy, end of quote. But when he set foot on Indian soil, he did so as a civil rights activist who had dared challenge its British overlords. Gandhi's refusal to submit to the laws, he was in principle ready to accept, but had they truly embodied universal ideas, was not only expressed through subversive speeches and defiant political actions, but also by his decision to discard Western clothes in favor of traditional Indian garments. Why was it so important for Gandhi to go to that extent in his opposition to British hegemony? By answering that question, I would like to show that it is possible for a minority to exert certain degree of social control over a majority of individuals without having recourse to overt violence, and as a consequence of this process, to create a society or a culture that is fundamentally dysfunctional. It goes without saying that people belonging to such a society or identifying to such a culture can easily be manipulated and controlled. Let's start by formulating a general principle. If the strategy of exploiting the group divisions within a nation, be it ethnic, religious, or cultural, is an efficient expedient to rule that nation, this is the famous divide to rule principle, that expedient is more efficient when the division is located within each and every individual. In the first case, the strategy can easily be upset the moment the divided groups come to refer to a common experience like that of being exploited as a motivation for taking action. Moreover, the divisions among the dominated people tend to diminish over time as the ruling minority has to establish some degree of uniformity among its vassals in order to maximize its power over them. So in this regard, we have the imposition of a single language as a means of communication or a single administration, the delimitation of clear boundaries, the construction of infrastructure, etc. To some extent, one could say that similar to the roads that were built by the Romans to conquer the lands of the barbarian, and which were later used by some of the barbarians to invade the Roman Empire, a ruling minority unintentionally puts into place the conditions leading to its loss of power over a ruled majority. In the second case, however, because a division is situated within a person, we have a situation where rebellion against an oppressor is made very difficult, if not impossible, simply because that person is already rebelling against herself. In other words, as long as the dividing forces have two different origins, the probability of harmonizing these forces by the acceptance of a common external goal is relatively greater. But when the dividing forces have a common origin, when they are located at the level of what should be, in principle, one unified entity, that is the individual, the range of action this divided entity can do is considerably limited. How is then possible to bring about this internal division within people? First of all, one needs to understand that the division of a person occurs at the level of what constitutes her identity, more specifically, her culture, her customs, her systems of value, her language, her religion, her history, or shared memories. Secondly, that identity is what defines her relations with other persons, and consequently, it is a social force that regulates the behavior of an entire community and to some extent put in place the condition for the realizations of the ideals of that community. Finally, to be able to exercise its regulatory power, any identity has to incarnate itself into concrete objects. For example, a flag, a hymn, common symbols, institution, religious and secular traditions. A community can thus maintain its identity and foster its development by controlling the evolutions of the objects that define its identity. If the description appears to be secular, it is no less different than how a common language maintains its integrity at the same time that it's allowed to evolve within a speech community. In fact, the secularity of the process of preservation and evolution of a community's identity is a sign of its autonomy, as it is capable of generating its own objects that will in turn foster its development. But what happens to a community when it accepts as an object that is foreign to its identity? Is it going to contribute to its enrichment, or will it be a kind of Trojan horse that would lead to its own destruction? If it is a Trojan horse, how is it possible to recognize it as such? If the newly accepted object is truly beneficial to the development of the autonomy of a community, one should expect that it would merge with the already existing objects, that the initial tension resulting from its acceptance is going to be resolved. So for example, just to make it, I know it's a little bit theoretical, but think of cricket. I know it's a very popular sport in India, but it says, I heard once, it's an Indian sport that was accidentally invented by the British. So it's a good example how a sport became, it's kind of interesting that in Canada, cricket never took but all the British colonies became very strong in cricket, but not in Canada. But we had another sport that would. So, but if that initial tension is maintained and even actuated, so he says we have two objects here. If a breakup of existing, if a breaking up of the existing relation starts to occur and it's even encouraged, and if as a result of accepting this new object, a person comes to feel ashamed of her own identity or part of it, we are dealing with a Trojan horse. This is, I believe, the reason why Gandhi decided to no longer dress the way his overlords did. He firstly realized that the wearing of Western clothes was motivated by or was an expression of a sense of shame towards his own culture, and secondly, that this sense of shame was implicitly or explicitly used by the British to create among his own people an elite that would act as collaborators for the realization of the specific interests of the British. Furthermore, Gandhi understood that the sense of shame instilled by the British and nurtured by an Indian elite at that time was putting into place a dysfunctional society that was going to its doom. He thought that by simply changing the way one dresses, not just as a means of defiance, but more importantly, as a form of reconciliation with one's identity, would reverse this process of destruction. So, how is it then possible that the way one dresses, or even in certain cases, just a piece of clothing like the veil worn by Muslim women in Western society, or the white socks of the Herzegovinian, are allowed to have so much destructive power? So here I have to give two notes. In some countries, Muslim women have been shamed into thinking that wearing a religious symbols is a sign of their subjugation. Herzegovina is a region of former Yugoslavia, and people used to wear white socks, and they were described as culturally primitive and part of the Balkan. So being part of the Balkan is kind of an insult here in this region of Europe. So to answer that question, so how is it possible? So we have to realize the modus operandi, the way it works, of the sense of shame at the individual or psychological level, since it is, as mentioned before, what the division is ultimately located in a dysfunctional structured society. This should give us a glimpse at how discourses are being manipulated to so that they constantly limit the autonomy of the majority, and by the same token, forces to act in the interest of minority. Okay. So now I would like to look at a little bit more deeper how it works, especially how the language is being manipulated. And so we have seen, based on the reasons why Gandhi decided to discard Western clothing, that the acceptance of a new object, am I okay with time now? I see it's almost, okay. So, okay. So based on the reason why Gandhi decided to discard Western clothing, that the acceptance of a new object which acts as a Trojan horse is tantamount to acquiring a foreign or part of a foreign identity. Since a person cannot easily eradicate her original identity, she ends up being the receptacle of two identities that may have common elements, but which in the present situation are acting toward two incompatible goals and consequently are incapable of reconciliation. As mentioned earlier, there is in principle no problem in borrowing from other cultures or nations what could be an enrichment for ourselves. The problem arises only when what is being accepted is introducing a purpose conducive to one's own impoverishment. In this case, in this first case, something is being selected, added to our identity, whereas in the second case, something is being taken away from us while we are under the impression of gaining something. Here we are in fact dealing with an imposture, and the object that is acting as the agent of our impoverishment will eventually have to be suppressed. We'll have to suppress the object that constitutes our original identity. So I give the example here of the Japanese samurai culture. You know, when in the 19th century, the rifle and the cannon was reintroduced, it clearly gave a military advantage, but by adopting them, the samurai culture was undermined, relegated to a relic of the past. And the same situation with our First Nation in Canada, when they started adopting Western instruments, they were gaining something, but at the same time, they had the impression of losing their culture or what was part of their identity. So without this suppression, an object acting as a Trojan horse will be too weak to overcome the positive or healthy forces of our original identity. And as a result of not being able to impose itself, will automatically be rejected the moment it is recognized for what it is. So what I mean here, if a society has a strong self-confidence, anything that comes from outside will automatically be accepted if it has some value, and if it's not, if it's against its own interests, they will have the strength to reject it. So this is what I mean here. So in the present context, the sense of shame has a double function. The first is to nurture the inhibiting force of the Trojan horse against the positive forces of our original identity. And the second is to direct our attention away from it so that it may not be recognized for what it is. Now, if this new thing that is being accepted at the same time is forcing us to be ashamed of our own identity, then it will have more, it will be easy to impose and to do its destructive force. So I give an example of this mechanism, and so some of you may be aware of the Bible story of Moses. You know, Moses was the one who received the Torah and who founded the Jewish religion or the Jewish nation. But before he played the role of a prophet, he was an Egyptian, or he was raised as an Egyptian prince. And if you read the story, the Egyptians were very much ashamed or despised anything that had to do with the Hebrew culture. So for example, their sacrifice and so forth. So to some extent, Moses was kind of having double identity. He was raised as an Egyptian, he was also in Hebrew. And this moment of tension comes as a climax when he saw a man of his own man was being beaten up by an Egyptian prince, Egyptian guard. And so he didn't know what to do. He decided to kill the Egyptian guard. And for that, he kind of went, I would say, he negated his first identity, but he was ejected. He was canceled, so to speak, from his first culture. So it kind of created in him a situation of inhibition of action. When you think about it, when these two identities are struggling, you are not able to do anything. And the more and more the struggle is, the stronger is the struggle, the more difficult it is for you to act. And so, and as I said, if we refuse to succumb to I try to speed up a little bit, if we try to succumb to, if we try not to, I mean, say to, sorry. So to some extent, what the sense of shame is doing is kind of adding some clothing to create an emotionally, to redefine our emotional level, an important part of identity, to make it toxic or to make it negative. So sorry for the hesitation now. I can go further by looking at how language is being used, but I see the time is almost, so I would like to see whether we would be ready for questions. So the next part is just to go even further into how language is being used to create that sense of shame, but we can skip that if we have questions, or if we want to move, or maybe in the question I'm going to answer a little bit. Professor Sharma, I think you are muted.
Surely, sir, I think we can have some questions. if participants are willing to ask some questions, they can. Otherwise, I have one question, sir, in my mind.
Okay.
This colonization basically works the most in having this kind of psychological and social mechanism
Yes.
built shame or to demote our own tradition and identity.
Yes.
I think that works.
Yes. I gave an Indian example, but I can give a Canadian example. We were also colonized by the British
Right.
because, and then we, the French people, we speak French, but we kind of develop a special way of speaking French because we are kind of isolated from the mainland of France. And I remember in the past, people saying, yeah, the way you speak French is a little bit like a peasant French, or it's not developed. And one day I was walking here in Dubrovnik, and in front of me, I could hear a man with a British accent telling about Canada. I say, oh, you know, these French people, they speak a kind of a backward French. I wanted to, I was so upset to see how even till today, and that was a way to say that, oh, okay, maybe we are not worth considering as a culture. We are not interested. And Canada is an English speaking only, and there is here a little minority of French. And so that's my own example, personal example in a way. I think what I saw when I look at India, the idea of clothing, the idea of the way to speak, and if we look at the bigger picture, is that if you really want to rediscover your past, you're looking at the tradition, and if someone somewhere is kind of acting, says, no, you should not do that, or this is retarded, this is old-fashioned, and so forth. This is what I mean here by the same of shame, the sense of shame. It's like, why would you? We have to progress. The progress is more important than the tradition. So.
Right. When you're talking about that school, even not just in colleges, even in schools.
Yes.
We are here having few, not right now, but we used to have a period when students are not even allowed to wear bindi on their faces.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, Christian schools. So those students who are applying bindi, they are considered inferior in front of others. So that is also influential phase from school life also. So.
Yes, yes. I can relate to that also. The First Nation, I mean, we have to assume our past, even if we were part of the oppressing culture at some point. So, for example, in Canada, the First Nation would be taught in schools, and they were refused to speak their own language. And so they kind of lost their own culture and language. But again, what is important is, I don't want to use the shame, oh, I'm Canadian, I should be ashamed of this. What I mean here, there's a mistake is being done, and we have to be able to see what happened, who did that, in what circumstances, so that we may learn from the past. But the same of shame here is used to generalize to an whole population, and then try to stop, to think critically about, and to reconcile sometime with its past. So this is what is going on here. I said this article was for Croatia but I see it as a universal. Croatian were very long, they got their independence in 1991, but they were always under the sense of shame that they joined the Nazis during the Second World War, although 10% voted for this government, but it was always repeated and trying to shame them. And there is a place which is a kind of concentration camp, and people are now questioning the numbers of people who were actually killed. The official number is astronomous, 800 million, 800,000, which is almost impossible. But the very moment they try to question that number, they are stabbed with, no, you should not do that. You should be ashamed of asking these questions. And so you see here again, the mechanism of not being able to ask questions to reconcile, even if your nation did something that maybe was not so good in a way. But that's okay. I mean, we all did, I think. But the difference is, yeah.
Thanks. If anybody is willing to ask any question, they can please go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah.
They can even write in chat box also.
No, I have given one.
Okay, there is one question
box.
from Professor Parag Joshi, sir. Which one is more stronger obstacle, shame or inferiority?
I think inferiority is the description, and the shame is the emotion that goes with it. So they kind of combine in a way. So if you say you feel inferior, or let's say your language is an inferior form of French, so that's if I relate to it, you should be shameful of speaking it or learning it. You should forget it and learn the proper way instead of developing it. So the inferiority is a quasi-scientific objective evaluation. The shame is the emotion that we want to attach to it. We can say something is inferior quality and without the sense of shame. So maybe someone did some work and it has a D grade and someone has an A grade. And you can see inferiority, superiority, if it's not attached, if we don't attach a sense of shame, could still be used as a way to evaluate the quality of something. That why not? But of course, if it applies to a person, then it's very much connected to shame. I don't know if I answered the question. Another way to answer that question, if inferiority applied to as a state of being, as opposed to the action, I think a state of being is more damaging than the action. An action can always be corrected, but the state is almost like a curse you give on a person. Yeah, you are inferior. You are something. And this is something we felt even as French Canadian by being reminded that our culture was a kind of disconnected from the main culture, and some people kind of had a sense of inferiority. Because they were ashamed of their own culture. So I know it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I thought when I read a little bit, I didn't know Professor Kalachari introduced me to your university. I read a little bit. I thought, okay, maybe here in the West, we are a little bit suspicious about our own past. Even methods like learning by heart would be strongly discouraged, but I think it has, I know it's a little thing, but it may have very some benefits in learning things by heart and things like this. So in pedagogy, there is a sense of we always want to progress, but we kind of forget what we had good in the past. So I thought that that could be, as I said at the beginning, I would like really to look into in the traditional Indian system and compare to the Japanese Zen context, the Christians, the Jesuits, for example, had a program of where religion and science were integrated together, and it's very interesting to look at.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. isn't even superiority or complex of superiority also has the same repercussions of the shame or inferiority? Because in the case of white supremacy, whatever that happens normally, isn't that also cause for obstruction?
Yes, my point of view here is that a sense of superiority could be a reaction to a sense of inferiority. So it's like you either one or the other. And in both ways, there is a lack of reconciliation with one's past. Reconciliation means here looking at the good and the bad things and trying to integrate them and feel peaceful about them. Whereas I saw the sense of superiority as a reaction to, let's say, someone who tried to be inferior, tried to label you as inferior. So it's kind of a response to so it's you are moving in the same circle, in the same, you are not moving on to something else. So the sense of superiority, I don't know, I think maybe it's an inverted negative feeling, sense of
Thank you.
In both ways, what it is, it cuts you from opening up to a new culture and be able to learn something new. Because if you feel superior, there's nothing to be learned. If you feel inferior, everything that is new is make you afraid or make you, I don't know.
Thank you, sir. I think you have wonderfully explored the values throughout your presentation. Values of our inherited traditions can only be beneficial to the development of our creativity and self-realization.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear from you.
Okay.
And you must visit our campus so that you must get acquainted with the Indian tradition, culture, and knowledge system also.
Yes, to be honest with you, I would really like to do it. I kind of resume my study of Sanskrit because I've forgotten. Also, with Professor Kala Acharya, I've been in contact and work on different projects. And I would like to come to see for the next years for me, what kind of projects could be done. I'm very much interested in looking into education and traditional education and its benefits for science and the modern. And I'm really convinced that somehow the progressive methods of teaching sometimes are okay, are trying to adapt to the new things, but seems to be leaving out maybe the good things of the past. And so this is something I would like to look at. As I said, I was very much impressed by the work done by Professor Hori in Zen Buddhism. I'm very much also interested in looking at how the Jesuits valued education, traditional education, and this difference between what I call person-oriented versus task-oriented. Task-oriented is like creating people to solve given problems, whereas person-oriented is much more holistic in terms of teaching. And the Jesuits were quite good at this. And so, as you know, the Jesuits are the champion of our education up to the 19th century, because they were not taking over, but the government took over the secular sector took over the religious, the education. But still today, very strong Jesuit universities all over the world. And so I'll be in contact if you.
Sure, sure.
There are a few grants I can apply even here in Croatia, so that will allow me to come. I think the only thing is the COVID situation. I hope it's getting better in India.
Yes, sir.
I saw many Indians now coming to Croatia. So I was very surprised to see that tourism is coming up. And we are not so far. We are just a few hours. So
yeah, and we are together celebrating 25th anniversary. Sir.
yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Now
welcome.
for formal vote of thanks, I would like to request Srinivas sir.
Thank you, Shweta ma'am. So I would like to first express our indebtedness to Shri Francis Brassard sir for delivering a wonderful and thoughtful, thought-provoking lecture. And in this occasion, on this occasion, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, Professor Madhusudan Penna, who is actually the main cause behind these kind of initiations. And he encourages a lot in conducting similar activities. And I would like to even thank and express our gratefulness to in guiding us in conducting similar activities. So we would like to thank Professor Krishna Kumar Pandey sir, who is the chief coordinator of the Silver Jubilee celebrations, and our campus director, Professor Kavita Hole madam, and our registrar, Dr. Ramachandra Joshi sir, who has been supporting us throughout. And I would like to even thank all the deans, HODs, and faculty members, whoever were present in this program and are encouraging us by their presence. And even I would like to even congratulate all the students, whoever were present here, all the research scholars and all the students for participating in this event. And at the end, I would like to even thank our Director of School of Shastric Learning, Professor Parag Joshi sir, and Dr. Shweta madam for conducting and coordinating the lecture series. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, sir.
So shall we what you call Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukha bhag bhaved. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.